Now that the SPD, FDP and Greens have signed a coalition agreement, social media is full of people saying, "Hooray! They're going to legalise weed! When does this take effect?" The answer to that question is it's probably going to take a long time, if it ever happens at all. It's important to remember that the coalition agreement isn't a decree. It's just a list of things that the coalition partners have agreed they want to do. And it's a long list. It's over 170 pages long. Cannabis is very briefly mentioned on page 87, and the details are vague. That's because, and I can't stress this often enough, this isn't a bill, it's just something the coalition has agreed is a thing that should be done. It's not a simple question of just writing a law that says weed is legal. The agreement talks about licensed businesses and quality control, and these things have to be legislated for. Even in the coalition agreement, you can see why this might be necessary. Partly it's to protect the consumer. You want to know that your guaranteed high-quality marijuana actually is high-quality marijuana and not mostly spinach. But it's also to protect society. It's believed, for example, that consuming marijuana before your 20s might increase your risk of psychological problems later in life. Now, if that is true, then how do we minimize that risk? What happens if we say, for example, well, you can smoke a cigarette at the age of 16, but you have to wait until you're 21 before you can smoke a joint? I mean, that might be the sensible thing to do, but will the voting public accept it? So despite the agreement, there's still plenty of stuff to argue about, and no guarantee that the coalition will actually be able to introduce a bill that all of its members can get behind. It's probably not very high up on the agenda anyway. The first thing that the new government will have to do is to deal with the pandemic and all the problems that that's created. And just now, a report on domestic violence has come out, and that's already putting pressure on the incoming government, even before it takes power, to concentrate on that problem. And there are other serious issues like immigration, homelessness, the environment. I would say that those are probably just a bit more important. But let's say the coalition can get a draft bill together. There is still a long way to go before that bill can be made law. Germany is a parliamentary democracy, meaning that a law cannot be passed without the approval of the people's representatives, the Bundestag as it is known in Germany. Now, I'm going to explain the process as briefly as I possibly can, and yes, that does mean I will be leaving out a lot of details. I mean, this is how the Bundestag explains it, and honestly, life is too short. So what follows is just to give you a very basic idea. The bill is introduced to the Bundestag as a draft. This is the first reading, and after that it's decided which committee or committees will need to work on it. So the bill then goes to the relevant committee or committees. These committees are made up of members of the Bundestag who have the necessary knowledge and experience, and so in theory should have some idea of what they're talking about. And these committees can also consult with actual experts. For example, I mentioned the possible effects of cannabis on mental health. So a committee might want to ask medical experts about this, people who have actually been studying this and can explain to politicians what their studies found and what the results actually mean. At the end of this process, a final report is written with recommendations. Now, in theory, this is supposed to ensure that any new law is grounded in fact rather than political ideology, but yeah, never mind. This goes back to the Bundestag for the second reading. Now, probably the committees have recommended some amendments. If so, then this is where the Bundestag gets to vote on those amendments. Once that is done, we have the final version of the bill for the third reading, and then the Bundestag votes on it. But even if they vote in favour, the bill still hasn't become law. It is now referred to the Bundesrat. This is made up of delegates from each of the 16 states, and they have to first check the bill to see whether it needs their approval. That might be the case if, for example, it calls for the states to set up some kind of regulatory authority, which is almost certainly going to be the case with this law. If so, then the Bundesrat has to discuss the bill in its own committees, and if it decides that the bill needs to be changed, well, then it has to work with the Bundestag on some sort of compromise. Now, once that is done, and yes, I have left out a lot for the sake of my own sanity, then the bill can be referred to the President, who checks to make sure that it doesn't violate the Constitution. If everything is in order, then the bill can become law. Remember, this is the simplified version of what needs to happen before you can legally buy a joint in Germany. Now, I can't see into the future, but my guess is that it's going to be a couple more years before anything much happens. And even then, I predict that it'll be little more than a relaxation of existing laws, plus some very strict licensing rules for retailers. Well, you can smoke a cigarette at the age of 16, but you have to wait until you're 21 before you can vote. Even in the